And hopefully we are live now. Welcome everyone to the curriculum committee meeting / working session of the Board of Education. We're happy that you can join us this morning. Of course, we have Dr. Mioli, who is our current Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum. Hopefully we are live now. Welcome everyone to, sorry, I have the live stream on too. And so that was my own voice checking to make sure that we're live. We're live. We are going to start as Dr. Mioli described it to me at the foundations. So we're starting with a discussion of what is curriculum today. And we're very lucky. We have several administrators with us, including, of course, Dr. Hines and Dr. Mioli himself, to talk about this so that we can have this information and this frame of reference as we move forward, thinking about the future of the Port Washington School District. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mioli.
Thank you, and good morning. I want to just introduce, while you can still see their faces, our two guests in addition to our committee members, Dr. Kimberly Liccato, who is the principal at Guggenheim Elementary School, and Mr. Nicholas Schreitweiser, who is the Assistant Director of Health, PE, and Athletics, and they'll be helping me today to talk about curriculum. So John, if you can put up the presentation, we'll get going. As he's doing that, I'll just say, I'll just expand upon what Rachel just said, which is, I thought it would be a good idea to actually look at the three component parts of my title, Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment, one at a time. And so John, you can go to the next slide. There's our committee and our guests, and then the next slide. Thanks. You know, there are a lot of connections and overlaps, obviously. And as you'll see in a minute, even the word curriculum has a lot of different meanings. But I thought it would be good to look at each individually over the next 3 months or so of these committee meetings, and to look at them in light of our impending work on mission and vision and the 5-year strategic plan, because that was one of the board goals that was unveiled at the last board meeting, and obviously something that we're going to be committing significant time to over the next months and years. So next slide. So what is curriculum? In Latin, the translation is something like a path to run in small steps. And there really are a lot of different definitions of curriculum. The word is used in a lot of different arenas for a lot of different things. You can talk about a curriculum in a class, in a subject area, grade level. In this case, you know, we're going to be looking at curriculum as that path from pre-K to 12, because that's what we're here for in the Port Washington schools. And so I have kind of two definitions. The first one is the one that I have up in my head when I think about it, and it's not very academic, but it's pretty inclusive. It's just all the stuff that's taught and or learned. And you know, although it's a short definition, we could spend a lot of time on it if we had the time, because I think a lot of times people think about curriculum as, you know, what is taught. But there's a thing called the hidden curriculum, which is, you know, what kids learn. Sitting in the same classroom, different kids can learn different things, and we learn things informally as well. But that being said, I think a more academic definition is the second one, and it's really what students need to know, do, and understand as they go through that path. And what we call those when we start getting into curriculum documents is the content, the skills, and the concepts. Next slide, please. So just a quick, you know, kind of historical perspective. Curriculum is something that changes as the world changes, as students change, as our lives change. Schooling has changed, and the purpose of schooling has changed. Our founding fathers were very fond of antiquity, as you know, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. And, their curriculum consisted of Greek and Latin, a lot of it, and even something that was very useful to them at the time in the 1770s, and that was surveying, something that wouldn't be particularly useful to us today. The Committee of 10, about 100 years later, Charles Eliot and at Harvard brought together a distinguished panel of educators and came up with what was known as the 10-foot bookshelf of learning. It was kind of interesting that we could contain all knowledge in 10 feet at that time. But that kind of curriculum lasted well into the 20th century. And then in the 20th century and up into this century, even in my lifetime, curriculum has changed significantly. In the end of the 1950s, when Sputnik was launched, there was kind of a furious drive to add science to the curriculum in this country. The rise of arts education, which is near and dear to my heart, began in the beginning of the 20th century. And our first curriculum committee meeting, we spent the entire meeting talking about social and emotional learning, which wasn't even really on the radar screen in terms of curriculum until about 20 or 25 years ago. So curriculum is viable. That means it's living, breathing, and it should always be successfully preparing our students for their future. Next slide, please. So what curriculum is not? And this is something that I think is really good to focus on, because again, I said that curriculum has a lot of different definitions, and these three are I think what a lot of people have in their head when we talk about curriculum. So state standards. The standards movement has been, I think, very advantageous for education. Even in the last 10 years, we've seen several sets of standards, even here in New York. Common Core was a big deal, and they've been replaced by Next Generation in New York State. But state standards aren't a curriculum. They aren't that content, concept, skills. They aren't attached to meaningful, relevant activities. It's just kind of a laundry list of things that the state wants us to do. And as Dr. Hines remarked, as we were waiting to go on, I have the entire Finnish basic education curriculum here on my desk, and it's probably shorter than the New York State standards because it really includes just a lot of things. I don't think you could read them in 180 days, much less teach them all. So a textbook or program, a lot of times we talk about how that is the curriculum, and it really isn't, again, for the same reasons. It does go a step further. A textbook or a program will have activities almost always attached to them. They'll have worksheets. But again, it's usually way more than we could ever accomplish in the classroom. Math in Focus, for example, is a great program, but the lessons are designed to be 90 minutes. Good luck with that. And there are, so many activities that are included in it to meet so many different needs that, you really don't use all of them. And then, of course, when I taught, the curriculum was like whatever I had in my file cabinet, a collection of lessons from when I student taught, and we didn't have teacher pay teacher then. But, curriculum is not just kind of what you accumulate over time. Next slide. So what should a curriculum be? Look, if we look at that path to run in small steps, we want to look at it over 14 years. And again, we want to make sure that it's helping prepare our students for their future. So we want to look at mapping out collaborative and communal decisions about those content, concept, and skills that I talked about earlier. We want to do it in a calendar form so that there is some kind of scope and sequence, and that everybody has an idea of what's going on in K to 12, and with an eye on our graduate. What do we want this path to lead to? We also need to decide what to keep, what to cut, and what to create. So that goes back to my point about curriculum being viable and changing. You need to look at the standards and you need to use them as a guidepost, but they need to be unpacked. They need to be taken out of that book and put into a classroom situation with activities and assessments. We need to cut things. We can't just keep adding things to the curriculum. And that's one of the hardest, I think, paradigms to face in curriculum, because you know, we always want our kids to learn more and more. Information is exploding, and you do have to cut. You have to look at things and decide what's more important than others. And finally, you need to look at what we're going to create. You know, when I went through high school, we were writing short stories and essays, and you know, they're still around, but there are a lot of different other media and formats that our students are using, you know, far more than those kinds of things. And that's just one example. So we use those standards, we use those textbooks and programs, and we use our practices, but we need to look at it in terms of that whole path. So I like this definition of curriculum after all those, that little kind of introduction, which is all of the coursework, the co-curricular activities, and other school-approved experiences. That's the school's formal plan to fulfill its mission statement and expectations for student learning. Next slide. So, you know, it's as much a process as a product. And I think you heard me say that at the last curriculum meeting when we were talking about social and emotional learning, because when educators get down into groups and start talking about teaching kids, you know, that's really where a lot of the magic starts. And I don't want for a second for anybody to think that because of that introduction, you know, we don't have lots of really good things going on here. We obviously do. It's a great school district. I've invested almost 32 years of my life here. And we do have lots of rich, rigorous, and high quality curriculum components going on. What I think the lens is that we want to just shift is that those components tend to be created in pockets. They tend to be created by individual teachers or individual educators at grade levels, within buildings, and significantly by discipline. And they also tend to be, you know, they have short-term goals. We have a curriculum that is meant to have a student get a good grade, or, you know, experience a set of vocabulary words and make sure that they can understand them all, pass a state test, satisfy graduation requirements, or get into a good college. Those are all great goals. There's nothing wrong with them. But it doesn't look at the totality, that whole path from pre-K to 12. Next slide. So this is analogy. The late Grant Wiggins was a real disruptor. He was one of my favorite educators. I want to throw this out because I think it's a good thing to make us look at the way that we do business. So the analogy is, you know, between having a curriculum and constructing a complex building. So consider what, you know, construction would look like if you wanted somebody to build you a home, if the contractors and workers had at their disposal what many of our teachers have to guide their construction work. So no blueprint, only a sketch of the building on a napkin, dozens of subcontractors who come and go. They work on separate rooms, hoping the end result will somehow fit together. Little discussion with the owners about the needs. Materials used, they may or may not be appropriate, but hey, that's what we brought 2 years ago, and we still have some. Inspectors are rare, and they're done on selected floors only. And, you know, there are only 180 days to construct a building, no matter what. So on June 25th, we're going to pack up our tools and go home. And if your roof isn't done, well, your roof isn't done. So this is a very condensed version of that by Wiggins and Matai, but I think it hits home if we think about curriculum in those terms. Next slide. John, next slide, please. Well, anyway, so what's missing, nope, we missed one. What's missing is that blueprint, right? the blueprint is that overall vision of where we want to end up. And it's the thing that binds all of those pieces and all of those workers together. It makes sure that we're all working towards developing the tools our graduates need to be masterful and independent. And that's a really key word, that they have performances as the goal. And Nick's going to talk about that a little bit later, and I think Kim is as well. So Heidi Jacobs talks about this in terms of the empty chair. And when we talk about curriculum, she always said that you should have an empty chair in the room and imagine one of your students sitting there. And every time you make a curriculum decision, you say, so how is this going to help Nick? Or how is this going to help Kim? How is this going to help them get through that path and get to be the graduate that we want them to be? So there are some examples that I put there. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but I think many of you know that I'm a former music teacher, and music does this, pretty well. Athletics does it pretty well. I think, again, Nick's going to show us a little bit of that. But if I want to be a masterful, independent clarinet player, it's not enough for me to just learn those skills, concepts. I have to get past my scales and my arpeggios. I have to get past knowing the difference between playing Bach and playing Dixieland. And I need to know, the content of what the repertoire has been, what the history of the instrument is. And I have to be able to put it together in a way that I can perform independently. So curriculum should be less of a tour of content and more of a design. There's that blueprint word again, for valid recurring performance tasks for students. And so, ending where we started, when we look at mission, vision, and we look at that profile of a graduate, what do we want our graduate to do and to be able to do? What do we want them to know, and what do we want them to understand? That's a great place for us to start our 5-year strategic plan. And that will give us a real focus for looking at our curriculum. And again, we're not going to redesign the whole thing. We're just going to look at it from a different lens. Next. So I'm just going to end with this quote. Again, one of my favorite researchers, Robert Marzano. He's been doing educational research for over 3 decades. And he has looked at so many different variables in terms of student achievement. He says over and over that a guaranteed and viable, there's that word again, a living, breathing curriculum is the #1 school level factor impacting on student achievement. So with that, next slide, I'd like to ask Dr. Liccato to talk to us a little bit about Finland. Finland has gone through this process. A number of agencies have, including a number of countries. And Dr. Liccato did her doctoral dissertation on the Finnish education system. And I'd like her to share, put into context some of those things that I just talked about in terms of Finland's story. Dr. Liccato.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mioli. As Dr. Mioli mentioned, when you think about a school system that really transformed themselves and went to the top over a course of several years, it really is Finland. It's a true success story. It's one of the top educational systems in the world. Many educators from around the world visit Finland every year. I know Dr. Hines did, as well as myself, to just kind of get an insight on what they do and what they're doing right. And personally, on a personal note, professionally and personally, that experience transformed me as an individual. And I do try to take ideas and things that I saw when I was in Finland and bring them to Guggenheim Elementary School on a daily basis. And I had an opportunity to visit schools within the city of Helsinki in grades 1 through 12. And I also had a chance to speak to professors at the university level to talk about what they're doing in regards to preparing their teachers to be working in the Finnish classrooms. Next slide. So just to give a quick historical perspective on the education reform in Finland, prior to World War II, Finland was largely an agricultural society. They were living mostly in rural areas, and post-war period, there were significant changes that took place within the country. There was an increase of people who were entering the middle class, and there was an increase for demands for better educational systems. As well as systems that were accessible to all children, regardless of their socioeconomic background. So in 1968, the parliament introduced legislation which ultimately reformed the educational system. And again, of course, this did not happen overnight. This took several years. But the outcomes of the reform included an education standards increase, educational inequality decreased, and competitive economy based on highly educated, skilled workforce. So they did that through a series of several years. Next slide, please. So in order to reform the schools, they had to equalize educational opportunities. And how they did that was they eliminated the practice of separating students into different tracks based on test scores. So everybody was part of the same cohort and of the same learning environment. In addition, they eliminated standardized tests. In Finland, they do take a standardized test when they are graduating high school, and that is in order to get into the university level or in order to go to a different route of education. But throughout their years, they do not take standardized tests. In addition, they created a common curriculum through the end of high school. And again, Finnish students start in grade 1. That's when the Finnish feel that students are prepared emotionally and mentally to start learning. So grades 1 through 12, they developed a common curriculum for the students in those grades. They also had a major investment in skilled teachers and teacher preparation programs, and they allowed local schools more autonomy to make decisions about what to teach and how to teach. So as much as they had an overarching learning outcomes and goals, they also had autonomy at the local level. In addition, teacher feedback to students was primarily in narrative form, emphasizing descriptions of their learning process and areas for growth. So it was not multiple choice tests, and that's how you assess the student. However, they gave narrative forms and feedback for students as well. Next slide, please. So they did develop, this was during the time I was there, they were in the process of developing these new national core curriculum ideas. So the process itself was a 2-year process. It was a slow rollout, which I think was one of the mistakes we saw with Common Core standards years ago with our country. They took a 2-year process. They had many stakeholders involved in giving feedback. And as a result, they had a lot of buy-in in the changes that they were making. So in Finland, the national core curriculum has 2 parts. It includes the objectives and core contents of teaching for all school subjects. And it also describes the mission, values, and structure of education. So as you could see in this diagram, the national core curriculum is like a puzzle piece, which meets up perfectly with the local curriculum. So the national core curriculum is set out for the country, and the local curriculum is developed based on the needs of the area. And as you could see from this as well, there were researchers, decision makers, teachers, parents were involved, and administrators as well. Next slide, please. The focus on the national core curriculum was the engagement and well-being of their students, which I think was, again, another piece that was missing when we came out with the Common Core curriculum here in the United States. They have a real focus in that country on the well-being, emotional well-being, social well-being of their students. And that was a huge focus of this national core curriculum. In addition, I thought this was very interesting as well, and it really is indicative of how they believe in Finland, how to treat children. The focus of the reform and curriculum was to improve the joy and meaningfulness of learning. So what they did was they did some research on based on PISA, and it indicated that many students did not have a strong sense of belonging at the school and at the schools, and their attitudes towards learning were not as positive as other countries. So they took that into account, and they developed this curriculum in Finland. So this was a major influence of the direction of the curriculum reform, was the joy and meaningfulness of learning. So again, it's enhancing thinking, learning, and other transversal skills, and it supports the development of schools as collaborative learning communities. In addition, anything in Finland is usually multidisciplinary. So anything that the children are learning, it carries over to the different areas of their learning process. Next slide. Again, it provides a common direction and basis for renewing school education and instruction. And as I mentioned before, it is a collaborative effort, this core curriculum that was developed. It involved the Finnish National Board of Education, as well as many different stakeholders that were closely involved in the process. So again, it was a 2-year process. Many interviews were involved with that, as well as surveys for parents, students, teachers, administrators, and the public was also invited to comment on the drafts as the process was being unfolded. The core curriculum in Finland was founded on 4 pillars, respecting the uniqueness of each student and guaranteeing the rights to a good education. So they really do take into account that each pupil is unique and valuable, just as he or she is. They have the right to grow into their own potential. They're taught very young on how they learn best, and they carry these skills throughout their educational career, through elementary school, middle school, and high school. In addition, promoting each student's growth as civilized, educated human beings and as an active citizen of a democratic society. When you go into Finnish schools, a lot of times you'll see connections from school to companies and environmental initiatives within the country. Everything is intertwined and everything is connected, as well as valuing cultural diversity and regarding it as a source of richness is a huge part of the national core curriculum in Finland. And the last pillar is understanding the necessity of living sustainably. So each school is expected to build its operating culture and functioning as a learning community on these 4 pillars. So as you can see, the national core curriculum in Finland is not only addresses academic needs, but the social emotional learning of students and how they could be better citizens of their country and better citizens of their community. Next slide. It provides teachers with recommended assessment criteria for specific grade levels and specific subjects, as well as overall assessment of student progress each year. If you do walk into a Finnish school, you do see many meetings throughout the year. There's many discussions about a student's progress. It is constantly communicated within the school community as well as to the parents. And they really do work on honing in on the goals of each student and how to elevate their success in their schools. They also use these guidelines to craft a more detailed curriculum, learning outcomes at each school, as well as benchmarks throughout the curriculum. It often encourages students to self-reflect and self-assess, and that is a huge part of the Finnish culture is self-reflection and self-assessment. When I was in Finland, they had mentioned that they did a study and they found that Finnish students tend to be shy, and it was having an impact on their ability to do well in the workplace. So they took that idea and they brought it back to the schools, and they developed curriculum in order to get Finnish students to be more comfortable with public speaking and things like that. So there's a constant reflection on their society, on their students, and how they can better themselves. The teachers themselves give formative and summative reports verbally and through narrative feedback. And that's an important thing that's ongoing throughout their years in their Finnish schools. And the major focus of the national core curriculum is inquiry. And this is used to cultivate the students' active learning skills. And this is done by asking many open-ended questions and helping students address them. So just like everything else, when you have a curriculum, you see this carrying over in the Finnish classrooms. And students in Finnish classrooms determine their own weekly targets with their teachers in specific subject areas. They choose tasks that they will work on at their own pace. So many times you'll see a Finnish teacher with an 8 to 10 minute lesson, and the students at that point know they're given choices. They're given ideas on on some choices on what to do with the material they learned. They understand their learning process and they work at their own pace. Many times you'll see students in Finnish classrooms walking around, rotating through workshops, gathering information, asking questions. So based on how they learn best is how they conduct their task and how they complete their task. There is an absolute cultivation of independence and active learning in Finnish schools. And students develop metacognitive skills that aid them in the process of framing, tackling, and solving problems and guiding their learning process in productive ways. So many times you'll see that in the classroom and outside the classroom. The adults in that community really work with their students in order to problem solve, which is a major focus of the Finnish culture as well. Next slide. And I think at this point, okay, I'm sorry, Dr. Mealy.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm just going to just unpack a couple of things there. And thank you, Dr. Licata, before I let Nick go. Just going back to what the focus here, the focus is here. I'm hearing. Are you hearing?
Yeah, I think Dr. Licata needs to mute. I think it should solve itself.
Okay, that better? All right. Just a couple of things to go to kind of align some of the things that Dr. Licata was talking about. First of all, there was a lot of talk about instruction and assessment. And again, I just want to reiterate that when you talk about a national core curriculum, you're talking about not only what is taught and learned, but you're talking about how it's learned, how it's assessed, how it's taught. And so instruction, there was a lot of instruction and assessment in there, which is fine. And but we will unpack those kind of separately in the next two meetings. Two, I talked about kind of a profile of a graduate, what we want our graduate to be able to know, do, and understand. And in this case, this national curriculum looked at, those 4 pillars and other kinds of outcomes. But it's that same idea of where does the path lead? Where does the curriculum lead? And then working backwards from there, what do we want to build to make sure that we get there? And then finally, I just want to also point out, and then I'll probably elaborate on it later, that even though they created a national core curriculum, they left that puzzle piece for the local curriculum, and that's important. And again, I'm sure that we'll get back into that later. So the next piece, I'd like to have Nick talk to us about the phys ed curriculum, and I think it's a really good example of one of many. Again, I want to point out one of many examples of a really good evolution of curriculum that has gone on in this district, particularly in this district, over the last few years, maybe more than a few years. And so I asked Nick to kind of do a, where we were and where we are now, so we can really see that word viability. Nick?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me this morning. And yeah, to build on what Dr. Mealy was saying, I think it is a good example. I'm newer to the district, and starting this summer, I continue to be surprised and impressed and just blown away by our staff. And I think we are in a good place physical education wise in the district, and that's due to the commitment of the staff that we have, and Stephanie Joannan as director. Previous directors will often go to conferences. We went to a few in September and October, election day, state conferences, national conferences, local Nassau County conferences, and we are doing just as well as all the presenters at those conferences, if not better. And we take pride in that as a department. Often we'll come back like the day after a conference and we'll be like, we're doing all this. We're doing all this already. So we're continued to be impressed by our team. Next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about where we were. And this is, early 90s through the 90s, and then into the early 2000s, where all 3 levels, so your elementary, your middle school, and your high school, were focused on team sports throughout the entire year. The units all followed the exact same sequence at each level, each day of the year, no matter what unit you were in. There was individual skill practice, but it was minute. So it was one student practicing at a time, someone in the middle of the gym, the rest of the class out on the side watching. It all culminated in large-sided games, which you would see boys on one side of the gym, girls on the other side of the gym. There was little or limited number of equipment, and there was large number of students, which meant there was not that much actual skill practice going on in a game-like atmosphere, which is what you want to promote in phys ed. Fitness testing did happen, but it measured your individual score on the national average. There was leaderboards that were posted outside gyms, and we highlighted the best of the best, which is we know we don't want to do that with young people. Class structures were all identical. Students entered the gym, they sat down in their spot. There was some static stretching that happening. There was direct instruction and commands by the teacher, and it culminated, like I said, in large-sided games, and then the students would exit. So no matter what day of the year you went into a gym, anywhere in the district, it was the exact same structure. And then social emotional learning was taught, but when we talked to our teachers and we said, how did you do this, back in the day when you first started, our teachers that are, up for retirement in the next few years, how did you do this when you first started your career? It was done through motivational posters that were on the side of the gym. So something that maybe you hit on one time of the year, you talk about that poster and then you never discuss it again. Next slide. Now we'll get into where we are now. And like I said, we're in a really, really good place within the district. We'll start at the elementary level. There's a focus and a heavy emphasis on individual development of each student. And this is done through station work, which maximizes the practice of students. We have an increased number of manipulatives. We take pride in the fact that within the district, we have a piece of equipment for every single student in the gym or outside on the field. If we're doing something, we're doing dribbling with soccer, we want a ball at each student's foot. If we're doing something like hockey, we want a stick in every child's hand, and we do take pride in that. There's student voice and choice, which allows for self-exploration and self-discovery. Oftentimes, you'll see lessons end with students stopping and then choosing where they want to go back to within the lesson. We do fitness testing, but we use the nationally recognized Fitness Grant program, which allows students to self-assess, see their personal best, and say, hey, where am I compared to myself last June? Where am I in June compared to January and September? And then develop a plan and develop a goal for improving. Skill themes and locomotor movements are done through consistent practicing, which allows for increased proficiency. We also focus on skill themes and strategies carrying over from unit to unit. So in phys ed, this is known as the tactical games model, where you could be teaching dribbling, but dribbling can be done in any sport. So you're just teaching that skill, and then it could be done in soccer, it could be done in hockey, it could be done in basketball. You're not teaching soccer and then teaching those skills. And this is done through offensive and defensive strategies and different things like that. And then we have a heavy emphasis on social and emotional learning in all of our classes. So this is systematically taught through that fosters cooperation, problem solving skills, teamwork, self-regulation. We're heavy on the zones of regulation. Just a quick on problem solving skills, you could see this happen even in our youngest learners, kindergarten, where two students may arrive on the same base at the same time. Class will actually stop and we'll talk about, like, how do we solve this situation? How do we solve this problem? And we'll ask for the students' input. And it could be something as little as like, hey, miss, we can do rock, paper, scissors to decide. And we'll do rock, paper, scissors and then move on. This is authentic learning. It's interdisciplinary. This carries over to the classroom. This carries over to recess and cafeteria. This carries over to after school on the playground and on the weekends. And all classes are co-ed within our entire district. Next slide. So at Weber Middle School, we're also doing this, and we have a heavy focus on the holistic approach to phys ed. So it's important for you all in our communities to know that New York State is updating the physical education standards for the first time since 1996. It's been a process. They began planning in 2018, and they started the rollout of the standards to directors and administrators this fall. So for us to take a look at the standards and kind of slowly bring it out to our staff, it won't be implemented in classrooms until 2023, the fall of 2023. Weber does a really good job at two of the new standards, standards 5 and 6, which talks about appreciation of personal wellness, which talks about the appreciation of the activities that are in your community. And this is done through consistent instruction and discussions on the importance of phys ed or physical activity outside of phys ed. So what are you doing that's physically active after school? What are you guys doing that's physically active on the weekends? Let's talk about it. What are you guys doing? Share your examples. At Weber, we also have weekly class discussions on personal responsibility, social behavior, respect. We're going to talk about those in a minute at the bottom. Our middle school curriculum introduces students to a selective program. So for the first time, students are coming out to the field and they may have multiple teachers that are doing the same thing, but at a different level. So for example, we're doing soccer and we walk out to the field. For the first time ever, we have, hey, Are you proficient in soccer? You believe you're proficient. You've played soccer with PYA on the weekends or PAL. You can go to this side. If you're just, you want to go out and have fun with soccer and you know the skills a little bit, but you just want to go out to a game and have fun and not really compete too hard, there's a middle of the road. And then if you're like, whoa, this unit's brand new to me. I've never really done this before. I just kind of did it in phys ed in elementary school. We have another lower level that's focusing on skills. This is the first time this is happening for the students, really, in 6th grade. We also have unit choice where students will go out and for the first time ever, they have, hey, if you want to work on this, you can go to this side. If you want to focus on this, you can go on this side. Fitness concept are advanced. We have a new wellness center at Weber that's coming. So we're really excited about advancing the knowledge of strength training, cardiovascular endurance. We do Project Adventure, which is focusing on team building and building trust and communication, problem solving, challenge by choice. And all our classes are co-ed again. So we talked a little bit about discussions that we have in Weber. The Weber staff has done a really good job at using the flipped approach to education. So they'll send out an actual video. Sometimes they're short, 2 to 3 minutes. Sometimes they're a little bit longer, 10 minutes. They have the students watch them on their own, and then they come to class ready to discuss. So some of the ones they've done so far this year, there's a great one on the importance of failure and learning through failure, and how when you fail, you have to make a choice on how you improve yourself. There's one on the attitude and how your outcome is affected by a positive or negative attitude. There's one on the importance of just 30 minutes of physical activity each day. There's one on valuing your time. So knowing how long you spend on social media each day. So they talk about, hey, students are projected to be on social media 9 years of their entire life. Students are expected to be sleeping for X amount of years in their entire life. You're going to be eating, you're going to be in school, you're going to be learning. So the importance of valuing your time. Next slide. We can skip over this. We talked about it. And then this all culminates at Schreiber, which we talked about, earlier in the presentation. Where do we want our graduates to be? And we're really proud of the selective and diverse program that we built at Schreiber. This has happened over the last, I would say, 2 decades. Stephanie said it, the process started in the late 90s. All our classes are co-ed, but students have the chance to opt into an elective-based program they're passionate about. Students will default to a 9, 10, or 11, 12 phys ed class. This is in 9, 10, we're talking about team sports. In 11, 12, we're talking about lifetime sports or lifetime activities. But they also have the opportunity to say, no, I'm really passionate about outdoor education. So we can opt into outdoor education, which is right now they're in the middle of an archery unit. There's rock climbing and climbing. There's they do mountain biking, they do geocaching, they've done skiing before. There's a fitness class that teaches yoga, Pilates. Right now we're in step aerobics. That actually will advance into a higher advanced fitness course where students are actually learning the techniques and then teaching it back to one another. Then there's advanced PE skills course, which this is, hey, this is for someone like, I want to go out there and I want to just compete every single day, and I want to in games, and I want to go out there in a lacrosse game and I want to compete. I want to go out there in a baseball game and I want to compete. There's a dance and movement course that I know we're really proud of. This is an interdisciplinary course that's working with cultural arts. We're actually working with Kevin Scully, Director of Arts right now, to bring our students to some few virtual conferences that are they're arts conferences and they're theater arts conferences, but they focus on dance. So we're bringing it to the phys ed students. That will advance into a advanced dance technique and choreography course. And then lastly, there's an advanced strength training and conditioning course that's for students that I want to go out there and I want to work, focus on my speed, my agility, my plyometrics, flexibility, my strength. So we're really proud of the program that we built. We're proud of the graduates that we have in our phys ed program, and where we've been and where we're going. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. John, before you just leave that slide up, if you wouldn't mind. And again, I just want to unpack and compare a couple of those things that Nick brought up and that Kim had brought up earlier. You heard the word interdisciplinary in both scenarios quite a bit. And, earlier I talked about one of the superintendent's favorite sayings, aligning the arrows. And I think, Nick just showed us how the phys ed department has aligned those arrows so nicely within its discipline. I just want to take that piece out and go back to that puzzle where there was the local and the national curriculum and think about how nice it would be, or it will be. And this is kind of the focus of what I want to get across today. If all of those things that we are talking about: wellness, interdisciplinary learning, performance-based opportunities for children. If all of those things were embedded in all of the disciplines and we were sharing that information. And I'll just give you a real brief example. We weren't able to play that video that Nick talked about failure. But if, for example, when we are done thinking about what we want our graduate to look like, and that's going to be hard work, but if one of the things, and I'm not saying it will be, but if one of them ends up being a growth mindset, that means that you always think that you are going to get better. And the word failure can be used, but you want to use it in a term like, I'm not able to do that yet. So you're always thinking that you're going to be able to do it, but you're just not ready to do it yet. And if that were a theme that were tied in across the grade levels, across the disciplines, think of how powerful that could be. If that same video could be used in the 5th grade to talk about it at an age appropriate time then, maybe in phys ed, in 8th grade, maybe in an English class where they talk about what that looks like and how they have matured through their middle school years, and then what that looks like as a graduate, how I approach getting into college, how I approach getting my job, how I approach living my life. Those are the kinds of arrows that we're looking at starting to align between and among the disciplines. So, John, you can go to the next slide again. Thanks. First, I just want to thank Nick and Kim again, and the committee for allowing us to talk about this. It's really nice to talk about a C that isn't COVID for a change. And I also just want to give a quick shout out to Stephanie Joannan. She is the person behind what you just saw Nick describe. And she really deserves a lot of credit for that. And again, this is just one example. I could have picked a lot of people to come and give you, really excellent curricular components here that we're doing in Port Washington. But quite frankly, the only reason I picked Kim and Nick is because they're non-tenured. So they had to say yes when I asked them if they would do this. The flip side of that is I told them that I would answer all the tough questions coming up next. So they get a break in a few minutes. But anyway, to sum up a little bit, Port Washington has a proud history of excellent schools and student achievement. I don't want in any way for this presentation to be taken as that we have to start from scratch and redo everything. It's not the case at all. Innovation and viability is ongoing. You just saw one great example. But I think the two things I want to leave everyone with is that a clearly defined, collaboratively determined mission and vision, including a graduate profile, that'll help us decide what to keep, cut, and create in our district curriculum, and it will help us move forward in making our student achievement even higher and more universal. And again, I know another of the board's goals this year and the superintendent's goals is equity in access, and I think that obviously this fits into that goal as well. And you saw that in the case of the outcomes in Finland. And finally, I'd like to leave you with this. James Strong, another favorite of mine, another researcher from University of, is it William and Mary? William and Mary, sorry, the other Richmond school. He wrote a book about world-class schools, and obviously it can apply to districts as well. And the research he did showed that there are 3 things that make good schools or good districts great world-class schools or great world-class districts. And those are quality, consistency, and what the impact is on the students. So I think with our mission and vision work, we want to look at consistently how that's impacting, how our programs are impacting students and helping them be the best they can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mioli and Nick and Kim. It was a really fantastic presentation. We are going to open it for comments now. Before I go to the committee, I just want to note for anybody who is watching, we don't have the active chat enabled currently, but you can email us at boe@portnet.org. I'm looking at the email account right now. So as the committee is asking their questions, please feel free to email in your questions and we will ask them and hopefully have them answered as well. With that, let's see. Deborah Brooks, you have the first question.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I learned a lot today. I especially appreciate the idea of self-assessment and doing your personal best, because there are some kids, especially in PE, who know that in the mile race or push-ups or whatever it is, they may never be able to compete for the top spot, but they can certainly try to best their last best. And I think that's a really important lesson in life. So I appreciate the fact that that's being instilled in the kids. But I want to go back to Finland. So Dr. Mioli, I guess you're in the hot spot for this. I was watching it and I kept waiting for, okay, well, that's nice. And so how is it applicable to Port Washington? I don't know what the demographics are in Finland. I don't know what subgroups there are identified. I don't know what class sizes are like. I wonder, how are they respecting the uniqueness of each child? I subscribe to that philosophy, but how are they doing it? And is there discipline in the Finnish schools, or is there no need for it? So all of those things, I guess, I'd rather not know in the abstract unless it can be applied to port schools. So if you could comment.
Well, I think the progression in terms of what I was trying to show over the course of those three pieces were that having a mission and vision, which Finland certainly has, and granted it's a country and we're a district, but I think the process was very similar to the process that we are about to engage on. And so I think from that broad brushstroke point of view, that's the big piece. Yes, there are incredible differences between how a country like Finland, which I think is, 5.5 million people, something like that. I think it's maybe smaller than Brooklyn, but and it's probably more homogeneous than we are, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, I think the backwards design of thinking about what you want our children to know, do, and understand when they graduate, those four pillars, what kind of people do we want them to be? What kind of graduates do we want them to be? And then building back from there and thinking back to that Heidi Hayes empty chair, every decision that we make in curriculum. So how is that going to help us to get there? Aligning all those arrows. That's the big piece. I think there are a lot of other little pieces in there. And quite frankly, I'm not as familiar with them as either Dr. Hines or Dr. Liccato. I don't know if they want to comment, but that would be my answer to, why I included it in here. I think I hope there's tremendous need to look at that in terms of what we are embarking on.
Dr. Hines, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I could jump in a little bit. Dr. Liccato, did you want to jump in before I did?
No, you can speak first. That's fine.
Okay. No, sure. No, because Deb's question is a really, really important one, because, it's nice to know about certain things, but if we can't use them, then what's the point of us learning about it? And I think there are a lot of things we can take from, not only, as Dr. Mioli said, as far as the process, but what gets them up in the morning, like really, like what is their purpose? And so here to answer your first question, Deb, it's a lot more diverse than we think. It is homogeneous, but in some of the areas in Finland, most notably the larger cities, it's diverse. There's a large immigrant population there. So they have a lot of L's just coming from different countries. And so that is something they have had to contend with over the past several decades, and they had to adjust, and they've adjusted very, very well in doing so. I was in 2 different cities, and one, Yoan-Su, which is on the Russian border, I want to say was almost mirrored our immigrant population, or just how diverse it was. I think they had 20% Ls, and not only looking at the way that they work with their ENL students, but even students with disabilities, the way that they tackle that. So there are a lot of different things I think that we could apply, but you have to think about this too. Their school year is shorter, their school day is shorter, yet when we look at their international ranking since 2000, they've either been number 1, number 2, number 10, depending on what content you're looking at, whether it's science, math, languages. So there's a lot of different things that they focus on. The one thing that they really focus on, as Dr. Mioli and Dr. Liccato said, was flourishing. In the end, from a culture standpoint, what do they want their kids to do? And to be honest with you, it's to flourish, to be as independent as possible, to be critical thinkers, and to understand how everything is interrelated. They're not learning one concept in a silo. They are bringing it all together. And those are things from a curricular standpoint, from even an assessment standpoint. You mentioned self-assessment. Many of the teachers I spoke to in Finland, that is one of the most important skills they want for kids, not just in phys ed, in the classroom. How do they think they're doing? And what are some of the tools that they're given in order to self-assess? And those are lifelong skills. So I don't want to take up too much time, but the bottom line is they think teachers are the most important profession, and they're trained like NASA astronauts. They are trained, I think, much more vigorously and rigorously than any of the teacher programs that we have here. And there's some things I think the universities can learn from as well. So I think this is a good starting conversation. And I think there's a lot of things that we could apply, not only academically, but in a whole host of ways. Most notably, having our kids be independent. And let me tell you something. I'll end with this because I'm not supposed to be doing this. I saw kids using tools in first grade where we would have 25 lawyers like just swarming. I'm speaking to lawyers right now. They would be like, you cannot have a kid. Yeah, I know. You cannot have a child use a handsaw. You can't have a child use a soldering iron. You can't have and you know what? You can. So they have very high expectations for kids and for the adults who serve them.
I think I'd like to add something too. As a principal in Port Washington, there are a lot of big picture items that I brought home in my own mind from Finland. The first thing is the process that they take in order to create a curriculum, for example, is slow and steady. There's a lot of trust in the system, and it's because it involves input from all the stakeholders involved. That's super, super important, and I take that into my building every day. Without the buy-in, you're not going to have the process be successful. The other thing that's super important is just the idea of the joy of children and the meaningfulness of learning, which is another skill that I bring into my building often. Kids need to understand why they're learning things, and they need to be happy. And even during these COVID, months that we've been in school, I said to myself, how can I make my kids happy in an environment that's difficult and restricted and everything against what I believe in as an educator? And a simple thing as a sign up for weekly hikes with me in the Guggenheim Preserve has been a tremendous success because the kids are getting out in the fresh air. We're taking a walk, we're exploring nature. And they have to wear their masks, but they're able to express themselves. And they often tell me how happy they feel out there. So there are many, many things that we could learn from what Finland does right. And we are currently doing in our schools. So I just wanted to add that too.
Thank you all. Commenting as one of the lawyers on the board, I would just say that issue of kids using tools, that's what waivers are for. So I'm all for moving forward in the tools, just with a very well-crafted waiver by our lawyers. Larry, go ahead, you're next.
Okay, so ever since I've been on the board, we've been talking about equity and inclusion and social and emotional literacy and all that other stuff. And yet we still haven't done much on the achievement gap. We still have growing amount of depression, growing amount of stress. We're more test and grade obsessed than we ever were. Why will it be different this time?
Well, I don't know if it will or not. I think that's up to all of us to work together. And as Dr. Licata just said, I think one of the really important parts of this endeavor is to get a lot of input from a lot of stakeholders and to have a good discussion about it. We haven't had that kind of meta discussion in quite a while in this district. There's a lot of discussion about this course and that grading policy and all the rest of it, but I think there is no better chance of addressing those perennial problems than by having all hands on deck, deciding what we want to see at the end of 14 years, and having all of the decisions we make line up to help us get there. Will it get us there? I don't know. I'm an optimist, but I'm not a fortune teller. So I can't tell you it will for sure. But even at my age, I'm excited about trying it again. I think this is the way we have to go.
Well, thanks. I got to jump off, but thanks a lot for that help. And again, everything we can do to help make this work is why I think we're all here. But we do have lots and lots of obstacles in our way, and we have to sort of fight against many, many powerful forces in order to do it.
Dr. Huntz, did I see that you wanted to jump in and add something?
I do. And Larry, just hear me out before you leave,
Okay.
if you wouldn't mind. There's a great book, by the way, called The Obstacle is the Way. And so I think if we use these obstacles to fuel us, which I think we will, listen, I know I talk about the Jets in a disparaging way for many years, but I will say this, and I'm a big fan of Joe Namath, and he guaranteed they would win in '69. I am guaranteeing, Larry, that when we embark on this work with vision, mission, defining our core values, coming up with the profile of the graduate, what that looks like, and embedding the equity work that is so important, what you focus on grows. And if that is our focus, which it will be, it will take place. And we have an all-star crew here ready to move forward with a very, very wonderful board that's looking to support this work. So that's why I believe it will move forward for sure. And we have Dr. Mioli for the next 7 years. So I'm sorry, a few years.
17 years.
17 years.
I'm out of here at 50.
Me too. All right, thanks. I got to run. Thanks.
I have a question for you as a member of the committee. So I think I join you in thinking that this is all very exciting. Overall, it sounds like you're kind of advocating for the overthrow of the antiquated parts of the American education system. But I think the subtext of what you're talking about, especially with Mr. Schratweiser's PE historical knowledge, is that some of this is already going on in Port Washington, right? Much of this is in place already. I think the ruler program that is in the process of expanding to the whole district, I see as part of this too, in kids understanding themselves and being able to be partners in their own education because they understand their own learning style, they understand their own emotional needs and their own motivations, in what we heard about PE. So my question for you is this, and maybe this is partly a comparison to Finland, or what's the plan look like here? It seems to me that part of, or one problem here is that parents are often not completely understanding what is happening in the schools. They get little pieces of it because, kids are intermittent reporters too, right? So they don't come home and say, oh, it's fantastic the way my PE class works. My teachers really understand that I need to have some free choice. And so we do this and this. And at the end, I'm always able to do it like this. They just say, we did this today, we did that. I don't like that one. I like this one. This one said something to me that I didn't like. And parents can't parse it. Is there a part in creating this kind of monumental change that involves the parents being a different kind of partner in education? Is that part of the process? Is that important? And I don't mean to dismiss the parents if we say that's not important, but does this happen without that kind of parent partnership? Is it a school-based thing or is it a community-based thing? Because I hear Dr. Liccato saying that in Finland, there's a lot of intertwining of the community and the schools. So what would that look like here? How do we make this kind of monumental change, at least in Port Washington, even if we can't do the whole country?
Wow. Okay, I should have written that down. First of all, thank you for introducing the next 2 months. We're going to talk in a similar way about instruction. And one of my answers to your question, even though it's a preview of things to come and it doesn't really answer your question, but you know, the whole one-to-one initiative, which we have you all to thank for and the superintendent to thank for, it has already and will continue to change how we do schooling. One of the things that I want you to see when we talk about instruction is how we use computers, every student having a computer in front of them in the classroom, not remotely, in the classroom. And I bring that up because I know the focus of your question is parents. And I think one of the scary things for all of us as educators about going remotely, and especially the way we did, like overnight, was that parents suddenly had a window into what was going on every day through those Google Classrooms. And it was a different kind of window. And so I think that I think it's scary, but I think it's good. And I think that will change the interaction in lots of good ways as we mature, and you've heard me use that word before, in our use of that technology. We were kind of caught unawares. I think we've come a really long way. I know we have. And I know that we are also, that's going to be a big focus moving forward. So to try to answer those several questions as succinctly as I can after all that, I think that I think it would be silly for us to say something like there is no parental involvement now in Port Washington. There's lots of parental involvement in Port Washington. I think that what we want it to be is to continue and to have it again mature and have the parents continue to help us make those arrows align, number one, and two, to involve more parents. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes that means, you know, parents of kids whose parents don't have the time to do that, you know, who may not be as invested in school. I think that's another one of the great byproducts of this backward design of starting with outcomes and trying to bring everybody along to get there. I think it will include and improve that parent participation.
Thank you. That's helpful. And by the way, I agree with you. Parents are a huge part of the schools in Port Washington. They're definitely, the parent volunteers and the parent leaders are the backbone of a lot of what goes on. But typically what I was getting at is, I don't know that they see themselves as curricular partners, and I don't know that the school has seen them that way. And I think that's going to be something that is interesting to discuss going forward, because I think there are very strong feelings about it. And it's much harder to navigate gray areas like that when you have parents suddenly involved. But of course, we want our educators making overall curricular decisions. You know, we don't want it to be that we're all voting on, as parents, on what we want to see in the school district.
And that's exactly right. And I'm glad you ended with that statement. And that's why I focused on those two puzzle pieces. when we were talking about Finland. And again, admittedly, Fort Washington is not a country, at least not yet. But it's really important that the parents and the community, the non-parents, and the business owners and everybody else that make up this town and pay taxes, that we all have a vision, a common vision of where we want our children to be when they go through our school district. And then the educators say, okay, how are we going to get there? And that's a really important distinction. So I'm glad you said it.
Yeah, I mean, imagine having parents be the kind of cheerleaders and supporters for curriculum that they currently offer for the classroom, and the sports, and activities too. I'm sorry, Dr. Licata, I cut you off.
No, I just wanted to add, I do think, as you said, that the parents are a big part of what happens in our schools. I know even at the compact committee level at the schools, we give a vision as a school and they help to carry out, but you're right in the sense of curriculum. But I think we could also think about making more connections, which I saw in Finland all the time, between our classes, our academics, our children, and the greater community. So for example, I went into a home and careers class in Finland, and they were working on crocheting gloves, and the gloves were given back to the nursing home down the block. When I went into the technology class, they were building toys wood toys that they were going to give to the local orphanages. So I think that connection of community to schools is something we could definitely build upon, especially here in Port Washington. And that may help as well.
Thank you. Julie, I think you had the next question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for this conversation and this insight. My question, and I'm sorry that Larry isn't here, and I think Dr. Hines, you were alluding at it, but just to make it clear, so from all of this and the excitement and enthusiasm that everyone wants to see moving forward for some of this change, maybe could we enumerate some of the starting points? Are the starting points the defining that vision, that mission, that profile of a graduate, so that we can, as a school district, not just see obstacles, but say once we have hit those markers and see those markers coming out publicly, we're going to see that some of this change is moving forward and put into effect.
Dr. Muley, mind if I start this? And then maybe you can be the closer.
Well, okay.
All right. So, and thank you for that question, because it's probably one of the most important questions. And it's a question I've been asking since I've been here. It's, what is our North Star? Like, what is our purpose? Why are we here? And so I know Dr. Muley talked about roadmap, blueprint, all these different things. We have to know what we want and know what direction we're going in. And that's going to start this spring. So with the board's permission, I would like to share that at some point very soon, as far as what the rest of this year will entail, what September will look like, especially once the vaccines are in place, so we can really, really begin this critical work. And then if you look at that as the vertebrae, the skeleton of what we have, then we have the real important, I want to say meat to this is curriculum, instruction, and assessment, and everything else that's attached to it. So that is what that process, I guess, from 30,000 feet will look like. And then there'll be a timeline as well. And then, of course, it all segues and funnels into what is our 5-year strategic plan moving forward. So as a Board of Education, you can make those important decisions with myself. I make recommendations so we can budget for these things as we move forward, and everything fits together synergistically.
Do we have any more questions for from the rest of the board? All right, I'll add another one in, and this is also an easy one, Dr. Muley.
I'll let Nick handle it then.
Give it to the new guy. So you talked a little bit about failure and the role of failure with no education expertise, but as a parent, I agree with you. And I happen to think that we have a large population of students, at least at the elementary school level, who never encounter that, who never hit what it means to have something that they cannot do, that they cannot just get by on their talent and their intelligence. And I just want to clarify, as I'm saying that, I don't mean just our core group kids, because obviously, not getting into the weeds, there are issues with identification, and that only identifies certain kinds of children. I think the group I'm talking about is a much larger group of children who could be more challenged, and at the very least are able to work hard enough to do well in what's put in front of them. So my easy question is there a way that this concept of needing to understand how to fail, and having it to be okay to fail, right, and to pick yourself back up and try again, is that incorporated into what we're doing in Port Washington in any of the schools at this point? And how would that be added in the future? What does that look like at the elementary level, the middle school level, and the high school level? Because I think we're talking about a lot of lofty ideals today, and a lot of us are in agreement about them, but it's up to you to actually roll it out and embed it in what we're doing here. And it seems to me that that's a lot harder than agreeing that it is something we want the kids to be taught, because you're talking about something that has to be taught over time, right? So what does it look like now? How would we add it in the future?
That is an easy question. Let's see if I can parse out the pieces of it. I think, first of all, I mean, I just have to say, I would not assume that growth mindset or a focus on failure is something that we're going to end up with in our graduate profile. And that's what the discussion's about. So even though you and I agree, and we know good stuff, we're good. So probably everybody else will agree with us, but we don't know that for sure. And I say it again, you'll hear me say it ad nauseum. The process is as important as the product. Sitting down and having these discussions and thinking through it and coming to understand others' thinking is really a big part of it. I think I did give you a kind of a quick down and dirty example of how that could be a thread, not only through the grade levels, but through different disciplines. But I think, the flip side of that is that, I'm going to reflect back to you that you were bringing up core group and a program, a PEP program, and we may want to not go back there. We may want to move away from that and start talking about another paradigm. And again, I use the word may. This is not, it's not up to me. And it's not necessarily up to you. I think the beauty of this is that we have conversation, that we get people together to talk about what we want that to look like. Then you as the board, the superintendent as the superintendent, you coalesce those pieces, and then we get to work in terms of how that happens. And that's why I think it was so important to show, at least within a discipline, how those arrows can align and how there can be lots of overlaps and interdisciplinary ideas and a lot of ways to, as we used to say, get to Boston. Just because that's our objective doesn't mean we're all going to have the same way to get there either. So that's another whole paradigm shift in terms of thinking.
Thank you. I think you actually just expanded on why it's even more complicated. Beth, I think you had a question.
I do. Question, comment. I think I just wanted to tag back a little bit on where Larry started. And this is probably more directed at Dr. Hines, Dr. Mioli. Larry mentioned that it's nice to talk about all this, and I think we talk about stuff a lot. And I think that Dr. Hines, since you've been here, you've talked about the only way to sort of make these kind of changes happen is to do this mission and vision and strategic planning. I think from my perspective as a board member, and I've been here for a pretty long time, what are our next steps as a board? I know you're working on your vision and mission. How do we start to look at what we need to do and how we can change the way we're working so that we can help support the district to really focus on making these cultural changes. What kind of advocacy is good for us to sort of encourage in the community? I mean, I think that's, you know, I think we're all in agreement that it's a direction we should go. It's a direction that's best for kids. So from our seat, Dr. Hines and Dr. Mioli, what is it that we can do best to make sure that we walk the walk instead of just continuing to talk the talk?
It's a great question. And it has so many different edges to it. So I think I'll just touch upon two of them right now. And I agree with Emily's comment. It's all about action. I mean, we know a lot of people who just yap and then they don't do anything, right? So the action steps that we will take beginning this spring is laying the foundation as far as what the Board of Education can do, and I'm assuming will do, is to support those who are part of this process, because it's going to be messy. And it's going to, we talk about biases and assumptions, like it was yesterday at our community conversations. We will be talking about some sacred cows. We will be talking about things that are going to make some people very uncomfortable, because we talk about change, and then once it happens, they don't want it to happen. When I say they, the collective, they don't want it to happen to them. It's like, I want this to happen, but not in my backyard. And the reality is it's everyone's backyard. And so that's why it's so critically important for us to define what it is that we want before we start doing what we have to do. That is, in essence, what this spring is all about. It's what do we want? How do we define when a student is in the Port Washington School District for 13 years? What are those attributes that are non-negotiable for us so when they graduate, they have those skills? This is critical work. And so the action comes after we clearly define that. And to be honest with you, with our school district, some school districts do this very well, some don't. It's eliciting feedback. And that's something we are looking to do starting this spring, which is engaging with our community, both with our educators, our staff members, internally within our school community, and externally within the larger community. What are your thoughts about this? What are your thoughts about that? Using that information and engaging with communities, again, both external and internal, in a way we haven't before. So we're listening to the collective voices, not just certain subgroups of our population. So this is going to be messy, and what the board can do, Beth, is to support, I think, the players who are stewarding this forward. That is going to be really, really important, because what's going to happen is there'll be pushback. And that's to be expected, and that's okay. So that, to me, I think is going to be really important. My job in all of this is like an orchestra conductor. I'm not saying that just because of Dr. Mioli. I'm saying that because we need to create this symphony over the spring so we know what we are doing as far as our strategic plan in the fall. And I can't tell you how much I look forward to doing this, because I really do. But and we're doing it during a pandemic, which is not ideal conditions to do this. But it's like anything else. There's never really an ideal time to do something that's really hard. And I know this board is up to the task, and I know they'll be very supportive doing that. And there may be some finances, of course, that are attached to it as well. You know, things that will cost money. But it's all tied into the board's goals. Your goals become my goals, which become everyone else's goals within this school district. And I think the board clearly defined those goals over the summer, and we're starting to act on that now. I mean, we see that just with the equity work, and we'll be talking about that come our board meeting on Tuesday. So there'll be a lot of energy moving forward, and we will definitely need your support in doing so.
Thank you. I mean, I happen to think in some ways this might be really good timing for it. You know, if you think about the flip side of crisis being opportunity, it's a time where a lot of people are being forced to confront what they've assumed are vital parts of the way their life is, or the way they do things, or their kids' schedules, or their kids' activities. And when everything is taken away, it is a moment where you can reconsider which of the things that you were just doing because you're supposed to be doing that are the things that you actually want to be doing or need to be doing. So maybe we can harness some of this crisis point to have this conversation in a way that's very productive. People's assumptions are already broken down a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree. And then to add to that, Rachel, I think a great example of that is the fact that we have a one-on-one initiative. I don't think, unless there was a pandemic, every student wouldn't have a piece of technology in their hand right now. And so there are definitely some things that that's an upside for sure, and it forces us to think differently. So I'm very thankful for that.
Deb, did you want to add your question that you had in the chat about whether all action steps require financial outlay?
Sure. Do all action steps require financial outlay? In other words, is there anything, Dr. Hines, that you foresee being able to do that doesn't require, not that the board would not agree to financial outlay, but and before we get to that point, are there any chairs that can be rearranged? And I don't mean actual chairs, I mean steps or philosophies or what practices or whatever that don't require financial outlay.
Yeah, I definitely think so, Deb. I believe not everything will have a price point attached to it. And if it does, it doesn't mean that we have to keep adding those prices. It doesn't mean that we can look somewhere else where we are already spending money and determining whether they're working or not, and then to reallocate those funds to somewhere else. So I think there are many different things that we could, think about. I mean, I can tell you right now, just from a curriculum standpoint, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but just curriculum mapping and what that looks like, and potential software that we may have to use. So let's just say we go down that road, because we're going to start building some curriculum maps, scope and sequence, so on and so forth, that may have a price point, but it doesn't mean we can't look in a different code somewhere and say, you know what, is this really, are we getting the return on this investment here? And that's what I'm talking about, sacred cows, by the way. And I'm talking about things, that have been here for a while that we'll have people advocating for, but it doesn't necessarily mean we should keep them around. Because I think in many cases, we have 20 pounds of things in a 10-pound bag. And I think we need to start looking into that bag and asking ourselves, should it still be here?
So now that we've scared the entire community, anybody have any last questions? No. Any last thoughts from our administrators before we wrap this up? All right.
Rachel, could we?
Yeah, go ahead, Beth.
Sorry. I think it's important to sort of end with we're not trying to scare the entire community, because it doesn't mean that something you think that might go away is going to go away. It just means that we really need to take a very hard look at how we are utilizing our limited resources to ensure this shouldn't be scary to anybody. This should mean that we're going to take a very good look at making sure that every one of those dollars has the best effect it can as we spend it. I think that's what Dr. Hines and Dr. Mealy are talking about. Not taking things away, but really adding richness that may not exist now because we keep doing the same thing and expecting different results.
Thank you for that, Beth. I agree with you. I mean, I think it's about what Dr. Hines has been saying since he arrived here in Port Washington, is that instead of just keeping on doing what we've been doing, it's time to take a real look at our district and think strategically and look at what our goals are. And our goals are the students. So that's why having a profile of what we want a graduate to look like is the starting point, because then we build from there and look at the entire program and say, how do we get there? How do we produce these kind of students who are ready for the world in the way that we think that they should be ready for the world? Dr. Hunt, did you want to add?
If you, and I promise I won't speak anymore after this, but here is something we have to keep in mind. If we look at the data as far as high school graduation, right? And this, we have to ask ourselves as a board, as a superintendent, and certainly as parents and taxpayers, are we really doing the best that we can as far as the percentage of our kids who graduate? If you delve into the subgroups as far as what those percentages look like, not just in 1 year, I'm talking longitudinal. Let's look at 5, 6, 7 years. Are we satisfied with that? And the answer, I'm assuming, and should be, is no. We're not satisfied with it. It needs to be much better. And in order to make that better, because what more of an exit outcome do we need to focus on than to make sure that every student graduates here in Port Washington? That is incredibly important. And that is something that will be part of my North Star. I know it's part of the board's North Star as we move forward in this. And that means we have to ask ourselves, there are some things that we're doing, actually many things we're doing incredibly well, but there are some things that we need to augment and or remove. And that's where these conversations, these courageous conversations, are going to have to take place. And so to go back to Beth's question, that's where we need the board. That's where we need our parents. That's where we need our educators and the rest of our staff here to really take a deep dive into this and to ask ourselves those important questions.
Thank you. I think that's actually the perfect place to wrap up, and it's the perfect time to wrap up. So thank you all for your time. We will be meeting again as a committee in the new year, and that will be posted, of course. I don't see any community questions in the email, but if anybody has any further questions, you are always welcome to email the board at boe@portnet.org, or our administrators, whose email addresses are on the website. Thank you all, and thank you for being here today. Have a good day, everyone.